This is the Before You Read lecture on the book of Leviticus, focusing in particular on chapters 17 through 26. If I were to guess, Leviticus is not your favorite book in the Bible to go for spiritual insight or encouragement. Many Christians that I know, under the cover of pastoral confidentiality, of course, admit that they haven't even read the book of Leviticus. And many others, with much more eagerness, indicate how little they care for the book of Leviticus after reading it. Admittedly, it can strike many readers as odd. After all, it is concerned with an entire institution, a cultic priesthood, and specific religious practices, sacrifices, and other rituals that are simply uncommon in Western society. If nothing else, much of Leviticus strikes Christians as something that may have been important ages ago, but it is certainly not important or relevant today. But I hope that you'll see that it is actually still worth reading, and it still has important insight for us today. As Jerry Sumney has noted in his introductory textbook, Introducing the Bible, Leviticus really interrupts the overarching narrative of the Pentateuch. We receive details for the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus, and even some instructions about sacrifice there. And then Numbers has several instructions about how to treat the tabernacle and how to move it from place to place. But Leviticus is located between Exodus and Numbers, offering something like a narrative pause to recount important instructions about the priesthood and cultic religious practices. The written book of Leviticus, as we know it, is likely the result of hundreds of years of oral traditions being passed down from one generation to another, likely through priestly groups. An early rabbinic name for Leviticus, the Priest's Manual, seems particularly relevant and an apt description of the book. It is not an overstatement to say that Leviticus focuses on the identity and function of priests. But it is also important to note that only a few of the verses apply only to the priests. Instead, the teachings of Leviticus apply to the whole nation of Israel. As Old Testament scholar Jacob Milgram has pointed out in the HarperCollins Study Bible, the priest played an important pedagogical role according to Leviticus. Priests helped the people distinguish between holy and unholy. They helped define pure and profane. They were responsible for teaching Israel how to not defile the tabernacle, but they also had the responsibility of purging the sanctuary when it was defiled. In other words, they helped the people know what they needed to do to prepare to meet God. Priests, like prophets, served as intermediaries between the people and God. They represented the Israelites before God, and they represented God, especially God's differentness, God's distinction from the other gods of the world, to the people of Israel. Their sacrifices, much like the prayers of the prophets, functioned as intercession on behalf of the people. Scholars have discerned two separate parts or sections of Leviticus, each with its own distinctive focus and vocabulary. The first 16 chapters of Leviticus are known as the Priestly Code. These chapters focus almost exclusively on the purity of the priests and the various sacrifices they would perform. The Holiness Code has its own distinctive understanding of holiness and pollution. Chapters 17 through 26 are known as the Holiness Code. This section extends the requirements of holiness to all of Israel. The Holiness Code instructs the people of Israel on how to be holy or set apart from their neighbors. In essence, Israel does this by two ways: through their moral life, through their actions, how they treat one another, and through their cultic life, how they engage with the divinity. That is to say, Israel will remain distinct in how they live and treat each other and how they worship. One of the central statements in this portion of Leviticus is this: "You shall be holy as I am holy." Israel is called to be distinct so that they can reflect God's distinctiveness in the world. For this class, we're going to focus on the Holiness Code, chapters 17 through 26. A word briefly about how the two parts of Leviticus differ from each other. Again, the study notes of Jacob Milgram are helpful. He suggests that the two parts have very different notions of holiness and pollution. We can see this first in terms of how they think about holy spaces. So both parts reflect that there is a holiness to space, but in the priestly code, the holy space is limited to the sanctuary. When it comes to the Holiness Code, however, it applies to all of the Promised Land. It's much more expansive. Both parts of Leviticus reflect on the holiness of persons. But the priestly code is concerned only with priests and Nazarenes, while the Holiness Code thinks about the holiness of all of Israel. Again, it's expansive in its orientation. Finally, pollution. Pollution is the opposite of holiness. It is what happens when holiness has been breached or contaminated. For the priestly code, pollution is concerned primarily with moral and ritual violations. For the Holiness Code, pollution is the result of a more fundamental violation of the covenant, and it tends to be more non-ritualistic. In short, the conception of holiness and pollution in the Holiness Code is far more dynamic and wide-reaching than the one in the priestly source. And this is important for our purposes insofar as Christians have adopted the language of holiness as characteristic of the Christian faith. I imagine that reading this section of the Bible will generate several questions. Why questions, and how questions, and what's the point of this questions? I encourage you to write these down as they come to you. We won't be able to discuss them all, but it will help you keep track of your experience reading the Bible. In addition, pay attention to the instructions about Israel's relationship with God. How do these teachings help prepare the people to meet God? What do they imply about the people, and what do they imply about God? How do these instructions relate to your own understanding of God? My guess is that the perspective of Leviticus may seem a bit at odds with a sort of God accepts me just as I am theology. To use a big theological word, Leviticus emphasizes God's transcendence, God's otherness. God is utterly different from humanity. And therefore humans must do a lot to prepare, even to approach God's presence, to say nothing of entering into it. Lots of contemporary Christian practice understands God as far more accessible. What do you make of these differences? How can Leviticus inform and enrich your own faith life? Finally, be on the lookout for the moral basis of the ritual acts that are outlined in Leviticus. It's easy to dismiss the rituals as irrelevant or insignificant because they come from a time or a culture different from our own. But I encourage you to read them with an eye for how they relate to moral issues related to life together in the community, about the treatment of the marginalized, and so forth. I can't wait to hear what you find. Now, happy reading.